Excellent. So I think everybody's familiar now with the fact that that there's been a settlement with the National Association of Realtors, NAR, and that it changes the way that buyer agents get compensated, or at least how it gets arranged. A lot of this pressure will fall, especially we're concerned about for first-time home buyers, which of course is your sweet spot. It's the work that you are professionals on. We do think that housing counselors will have to have a key role in being problem solvers in this and helping first-time home buyers navigate this particular set of problems. And I think our goal here is really to talk about what the significance of the NAR settlement is, and then where it can lead so that housing counselors are more effectively being able to speak to their clients about how to manage the situation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, I believe, from the National Association of Realtors.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for the opportunity to present and your all's attention and desire to become informed about these changes and what that is going to mean for the consumers, because that is something that we are very much interested in promoting information far and wide, not just among our memberships, but among real estate professionals, practitioners, those are involved in the industry, and that of course includes housing counselors, to try to make sure that consumers understand their role in all of this and are educated and informed about their options. Now, as was said, this is a discussion about an NAR settlement, so I'm not going to get into the full litigation history of what got us here, but a settlement means that some kind of conflict was getting resolved. And so the matter that was at issue was a series of lawsuits that were filed on behalf of home sellers, a class of home sellers in various areas of the country. The theories of the case was essentially that the NAR rule, which applied to all realtor-owned MLSs around the country, which said that if you are a participant in the multiple listing service and you have a listing in the MLS, you must disclose how much, if anything, you're offering in the form of cooperative compensation. Now, NAR did not set any amounts. It was historically understood it could be as little as $1 or even a penny. And when we were asked if it could be zero, we said, yes, it could be zero. The important thing is that there is disclosure. So that the buyer can make an informed decision as to whether or not they can afford to write an offer on the property and still get the representation that they want. Now, the plaintiff's theory of the case was that this somehow amounted to a conspiracy in violation of antitrust law. We vehemently opposed that. We believe that these offers of compensation are pro-consumer and pro-competitive because it means that the seller has the ability to promote interest in their property as they see fit, which could include, making sure that they are putting their property in front of the broadest range of prospective buyers. And that demand, in turn, increases the likelihood that the seller will get the best offer on the property that meets their needs. Similarly, we believe that these policies benefited buyers because buyers, of course, are already in a cash-constrained environment. You all know this better than I do, that they are struggling to save up for down payment, closing costs, and things like that, to add costs of representation, which we know that they want in this significant financial transaction, could be cost prohibitive to buyers, and this doesn't serve anybody's needs. Now, despite that position, you all may be aware that in October of last year, after an 11-day jury trial, a jury found NAR and a couple of the remaining corporate co-defendants liable for antitrust damages and antitrust behavior. We still vehemently disagree with that decision. We announced that we would appeal, but in the meantime, there were over 24 copycat lawsuits that were filed across the country against an increasing number of state and local realtor associations, multiple listing services, and our member brokerages. And so we were hearing from the industry, this can't drag on forever. We need some certainty. We need some clarity going forward. Otherwise, even if we continue to fight this and even won on appeal, it would just go back and be a new trial. And in the meantime, we have these 24 cases that are hanging out there. So we entered into discussions and settlement negotiations with the plaintiffs' attorneys. Next slide, please. And the outcome of that is, so I'm talking about the settlement overview here right now. We're going to get into the impact and how we're presenting these changes to the consumer so that they understand. Next slide, please. And next slide. So on March 15th, we announced a proposed settlement agreement that would end this litigation of claims against NAR, all state and territorial and local realtor associations, most multiple listing services, and almost all of our members and their brokerages brought on behalf of these home sellers related to broker compensation. Now, this settlement has received preliminary approval from the court, but it is still subject to final court approval, as is in the case in any antitrust class action litigation. A hearing on that final approval is scheduled for November 26th. That's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. But when we were contemplating this settlement agreement, we wanted to make sure that we had three goals. Of course, number one is we wanted to secure a release of liability for as many members, associations, and MLSs as possible. But significantly, we wanted to make sure that we were still protecting consumer choice regarding their ability to have real estate services and compensation. We were concerned that completely getting rid of offers of compensation, that is, compensation offered by the seller or the listing broker to a buyer broker who brings the buyer to the transaction, that would harm consumers, sellers and buyers alike, but would have a particularly negative effect on first-time home buyers, low-income buyers, and those from historically underrepresented and underserved communities. So we wanted to still fight to preserve this choice. And of course, we want to make sure that we are continuing to promote the American dream of homeownership for all. And we believe that the settlement has accomplished these goals. Next slide, please. So we have all kinds of resources that are publicly available. We'll share a link toward the end as to where most of these are housed. But we're trying to be as transparent as possible about this. We have over 100 answers to frequently asked questions. We have over a dozen videos that are on the site explaining the settlement, explaining the practice changes. We have a timeline, which you're going to see in just a moment, which is publicly available. We are hosting series of webinars to try to get this information out there in the hands of everybody that is being impacted by the settlement and the practice changes. And if you really want some light bedtime reading, we do have a copy of the settlement agreement that you can peruse as well. This is all publicly available. Next slide, please. So what are the core aspects of the settlement? Of course, number one is the release of liability, which I'm not going to spend a ton of time on. But more significantly, I'm going to be focusing on the two main practice changes. Offers of compensation are prohibited on the MLS, and written buyer agreements are going to be required prior to touring a home. Significantly, though, I would, like to say that we understand, that how things can be presented in the media, particularly with respect to if you've agreed to pay money and agreed to a settlement, that maybe that admits that there's some kind of wrongdoing, and that is not the case. And we fought to preserve offers of compensation, and they are preserved in the settlement agreement as an option for consumers, even if they may not be communicated via the MLS. And so we want to make sure that that is abundantly clear, that that is our position going forward. We are agreeing to this as a compromise, but that we are not admitting to any wrongdoing, because we still believe in these rules as being pro-consumer. Next slide, please. So here's the timeline for those that are visual learners, and this is available on facts.realtor. But it'll walk you through from March 15th when the settlement was announced all the way through November 26th when there's a hearing for final approval. Of particular note, though, that is going to be impacting you all from across the country and the communities and consumers that you serve is that August 17th is the deadline by which all multiple listing services that have opted into the settlement agreement must implement the practice changes. This is because August 17th is the earliest date on which the plaintiffs can start sending out the class notice to the impacted or potential members of the class. And so we need to make sure that we have the practice changes in place in order to mitigate potential liability and make sure that these practice changes are implemented swiftly. Next slide, please. So I mentioned these settlement resources. We'll circle back to that at the end, but just remember facts, facts.realtor is your resource for everything. Next slide, please. So understanding the impact. Next slide, please. We emphasize here is that we are committed to consumer choice, and the settlement preserves consumer choice in the home buying and selling process. Offers of compensation, or is another way of saying the ability of sellers or listing agents to compensate agents representing the buyer, is prohibited on the MLS, but is still as preserved as an option off the MLS based on negotiations between consumers and real estate professionals. What we are advising our members is to think of themselves in more of a consultative role. And this is something that you all should be very, familiar with, is that we want our members thinking of their job to be presenting the options and choices to consumers, sellers, and buyers alike, the pros and cons of each, so that the consumer is making the informed decision as to what to do. But we've worked very hard to make sure that we are preserving this choice. So buyers and sellers are going to continue to have flexibility to negotiate the compensation or fees that work for them and their transaction. Commissions have always been negotiable and will continue to be negotiable. And written buyer agreements are not here to try to, force the consumer, the buyer, into an agreement or a relationship that they don't want. They are here to promote transparency, to make sure that the consumer understands compensation, the services that are being provided, and where that compensation is coming from. Next slide, please. So a key part of this, of course, is to ensure that offers of compensation remain an option off the MLS, because they are a critical tool to ensuring the American dream of homeownership remains accessible to everyone. We have been and will continue to be particularly concerned about the potential impacts of moving away from offers of compensation and how that could have a negative impact on sellers, of course, but also significantly first-time buyers, low-income buyers, our veteran population. We are pleased to share, and this is something you may have already heard, but Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and HUD have confirmed that buyers whose agents or brokerages are compensated by the seller, whether that's a form of a direct payment from the seller to the buyer broker, from a portion of the listing broker's compensation, and or in the form of seller concessions that the buyer applies towards compensating their representative, they will still have access to financing under these programs, that they will not treat those seller payments as interested party contributions, IPCs, that are subject to those caps. We are particularly concerned about, veterans being further disadvantaged in the marketplace as well. And so the Bureau, or the Department of Veterans Affairs, recently announced it is going to lift its ban on buyers paying for real estate representation. That doesn't mean that, of course, the veteran borrower can still try to negotiate seller concessions, offers of compensation, things like that. But it does free up to make sure that veterans still remain competitive and can get the representation that they want and need in the transaction. The new VA policy takes effect August 10th, in time for our practice changes on August 17th. Next slide, please. We cannot state this enough. NAR supports fair housing. Offers of compensation are just one part of all of this. We will continue to remind our members that this does not relieve, nothing in the settlement agreement relieves them of their obligations to follow fair housing law and Article 10 of the Code of Ethics. And that means that when we're talking about the settlement, they must present buyer agreements and must ensure they're opening the conversation the same way with every buyer. And it is the seller's decision whether to authorize offers of compensation to buyer brokers, but it is illegal to refuse to authorize compensation or offer different compensation because of the buyer or the buyer's agent's protected characteristics or class. Next slide, please. So what do these practice changes actually look like? So one of the significant practice changes is that written buyer agreements are going to be required to be entered into with every MLS participant prior to touring a home. So there are two pieces of this that are triggering this. Number one is that the MLS participant has to be working with the buyer. What does working with the buyer mean? That means that the broker is providing brokerage or real estate services to the buyer, working in the buyer's interests, and do not have a pre-existing or separate relationship with the seller. So, for example, if a listing agent or an agent is hosting an open house and an unrepresented buyer comes in, they do not need to have a written buyer agreement because while they're hosting the open house, the agent is working with the seller, not with the buyer. State law may require certain disclosures to an unrepresented party. We're not supplanting any of that, but that in that scenario, where the unrepresented buyer comes in, the agent is working with the seller. They do not need to have a written buyer agreement. But in just about any other scenario where a buyer is going to be working with a buyer agent, buyer broker, they need to have a written agreement prior to touring a home. So what does it mean to tour a home? This means physical entry by the buyer's agent, or somebody at the buyer's agent's direction. And so I've heard every version of this, but this is hopefully just help clarify the standard for you all. Number one is that it can't be just a situation where, well, I'm the buyer agent. I opened up a lockbox and opened the door, but I didn't go in with the buyer. The buyer just went in. I'm not giving a tour. No, that is still physical access to the property. That is a tour. Or the buyer's not present. Maybe they're out of town and you're doing a virtual tour, like on phone or FaceTime or something like that. The agent is still in the property. That is a tour. And what do we mean by home? This is what happens when you get lawyers involved, of course. Um, a home is, we use HUD's definition, is any property on which there is 1 to 4 residential dwelling units. This does not apply to vacant land. It does not apply to commercial. It does not apply to multifamily. So in those scenarios, those two things, working with the buyer and prior to touring a home, you need to have a written buyer agreement. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is what we're talking about with our members, and then I'll switch to like kind of the communications with the consumers. But we know the value that all real estate professionals bring to this transaction. We need to be clearly articulating that value to consumers. When we're talking to consumers, we're focusing on the things that matter most to them, not to the brokerage. Reducing stress in a highly complicated and high stakes transaction, likely one of the biggest of their lives. Having trusted advisors through the transaction and demystifying the home buying or selling process. And using extensive experience to prepare consumers to navigate difficult negotiations, this is, I think, particularly relevant for you all, identify real estate professionals to work with, write the best offer possible, set the right price for a listing, and help consumers avoid common mistakes, all to help them achieve their goal, which is to buy and sell property. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about offers of compensation, this is the practice changes, and we want to really hone in on this. A realtor, a member of the National Association of Realtors, has a duty under the Code of Ethics to have open and honest conversations with consumers throughout the home buying and selling process. As before, our members, MLS participants, must explain compensation is fully negotiable, and offers of compensation remain an option as a matter of negotiation between the professional and the consumer. When listing brokers are making offers of compensation, there are going to be changes on where they may communicate those offers. They are no longer allowed on the multiple listing service, but offers of compensation, which means from the seller or the listing broker, may be communicated in other ways if the seller chooses to do so. They can make them off of the MLS. That means that brokers can put offers of compensation on their own websites for their own listings, not for anybody else's, but just for their own. They can send out emails, texts, calls. They can respond to inquiries from buyer brokers. They can put offers on the signs or on a rider. They can put it in a flyer in the property. There are a variety of ways that these can be communicated. They just cannot be anywhere on the MLS. The settlement does preserve the ability, if the seller would choose to, the seller may advertise that they are willing to offer concessions to the buyer, and can offer of concessions may be in the MLS, in the multiple listing service. So that means that they could simply say that seller is willing to offer, it could be a yes, no, it could be a dollar amount, or just a willingness to consider offers that include a request for concessions, some or all of which the buyer may apply towards buyer broker compensation. The key thing here is that in the MLS, they cannot say anything about conditioning those concessions on retention or payment of buyer broker compensation. So it just is willingness to, consider concessions and negotiate those. They ultimately have to still be in the purchase and sale agreement to be enforceable. But in the MLS, they can make no reference to buyer broker compensation. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to written buyer agreements, we are informing consumers that they are going to have to enter into written buyer agreements prior to touring a home. Now, these written agreements are required both for in-person and live, like I talked about before. You do not need a written agreement if you're just speaking to an agent at an open house or asking them about their services. It is both working with the buyer and then also, the actual act of going to tour a home. As before, agent compensation for home buyers continues to be fully negotiable. And so when finding an agent to work with, ask questions about compensation and these written agreements. There are approximately now 24 states, I believe, that have enacted laws requiring buyer agreements. So check your state laws on buyer agreements as you're searching or become familiar with the state laws. 6 months ago, it was only 18 states. So this is an evolving environment. Certainly, you all are the experts on keeping up to date on what's happening in your states and localities. Now, we want to be abundantly clear. NAR policy is not dictating what these buyer agreements are going to be. We are not dictating the type of a relationship between the buyer and the broker or the services being provided. Those are going to be whatever the broker and the consumer negotiate amongst themselves and what is permitted under state law. And every state has different standards and practices as to what's permissible. But the buyer agreement must include terms that make sure that the buyer understands the compensation that the broker can be paid from any source, that they cannot receive compensation in excess of that amount. That amount must be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. You have to be able to determine how much it is by looking at the agreement. Can't be anything like whatever the listing broker or the seller is offering. So this is intended to enhance consumer awareness and understanding, but we are saying that this can be any type of relationship that's applicable, that's permitted under state law. So that could be agency, that could be non-agency, that could be transaction brokerage, it could be exclusive, non-exclusive, it could be limited service, it could be full service, it could be short-term, it can be long-term. It could be a one-time showing agreement or touring agreement. Those are all permitted under this. They just have to make sure that they address the compensation issue. Next slide, please. So what comes next? Well, we've got the August 17th deadline. Now, some MLSs in some of your markets may be implementing that sooner. So I would certainly make sure that you're keeping up to date on what's going on with with the local realtor associations and MLSs in your area to determine when those deadlines are. We're saying it has to be by August 17th. Some are implementing it even sooner than that. I would certainly recommend that you all go and, and we are also recommending that our associations develop good relationships with housing counselors if they've not already done so, to make sure that this information is getting out there. Become familiar with the standard forms changes that are implementing all of these so that you can guide consumers through these changes and help them navigate. And we're certainly here to support, and hopefully my presence here today indicates our desire to have a good working relationship here so that everybody is, making sure the consumer is getting consistent information and is prepared for these changes. We do have the final settlement approval hearing on November 26th. Between now and then, there may be opt-outs. Parties like Department of Justice may weigh in with a statement of interest or something like that. They do not have veto power. over the settlement agreement. So they would be one voice among many for the court to consider. The court's guiding principle is supposed to be that is this agreement fair and reasonable to the parties and for the class? And both NAR and plaintiffs' attorneys agree that it is fair and reasonable. So we do hope that will be the outcome. But in the meantime, we have engaged in productive conversations with Department of Justice to try to see if we can find common ground on this and other issues to avoid prolonged litigation and hopefully come up with a clear, consistent guidance for everybody going forward. So to remove some of this uncertainty. I appreciate your all's time and your attention. I know that we are running long, but certainly want to encourage you to go to facts.realtor for all of this information. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for that great introduction, Matt. I'm going to talk about the NAR settlement and what it means for the housing counselors. I'm very excited to be giving this talk today because I think the settlement is going to be very, very good in the long run. It's going to bring down costs. However, in the short run, it's going to be extremely confusing, and especially confusing for potential borrowers. So I'm really, really glad we have the opportunity to talk about this today. Next slide, please. So as Matt mentioned, the settlement is effective on August 17th, 2024, with final approval expected in November 2024. The two important things the settlement does is, first, it prohibits offers of compensation on all MLS owned by one or more NAR organizations. However, it does not specify new compensation practices. So it throws out the old system, but it doesn't tell you what to replace it with. And second, today I'm going to talk about what I think is the most logical replacement and why I think it's the most logical replacement. And then the NAR has long, as Matt mentioned, the NAR has long encouraged written agreements between buyers and their realtors. These agreements will now be required, and this is actually a very good thing. It basically allows for accountability between the buyer and their agent. And the one wild card, as Matt mentioned, is the Department of Justice has reopened their investigation of NAR. The hope is that everything is settled and the Department of Justice does not throw a monkey wrench into the final settlement, but that remains to be seen. But as it is, final approval of the settlement is expected in November 2024. Next slide, please. The NAR settlement is consistent with a wide range of business practices. Again, the settlement threw out the old system, but it didn't specify what the new system is. So in particular, the buyers and sellers each negotiate the basket of services they want and the price they want to pay with with their agent. So prior, there was usually the seller's agent posted an offer of compensation on the MLS that said we'll split the commission, and the buyer's agent saw that. Buyer had no input whatsoever. This allows the buyer and seller to each select the basket of services they want. So it allows a buyer to say to their agent, I've done this several times before. I really only need your help helping me negotiate a home I want to buy, helping me negotiate the price, helping me figure out comparables and where to bid. And I need your help reviewing the contract. I don't need your help schlepping me around to open houses or showing me homes. I can set all that up myself. Or the seller may say to their agent, you know what? I can run my own open houses. I can make my own appointments. I really want your help in terms of evaluating offers or contract only. So it basically allows for, sort of for different types of services to be provided. Full service, advice only, negotiation only, some combination. It also allows for different types of fee structures. I'll pay you hourly, flat price, percent of sale price. So it allows for a wide variety of options depending on the basket of services that are selected. Next slide, please. The really important question that everyone is confused about is who pays the fees. The sellers could negotiate a fee with their agents and the buyers could negotiate a fee with theirs, where the seller actually pays both agents. And right now, of course, the seller pays both agents. The seller could negotiate a fee with their agent and the buyers could negotiate a fee with theirs, and each pays their own agent. So then the question is, which of these structures make the most sense? So if I were a seller's agent, what would I say to my seller? And I'm going to pretend like Matt is my seller because he happens to be sitting in the right place on my screen. Matt, you're selling your house. You've got two choices. Yes, the NAR settlement says you don't have to pay the buyer's, you don't have to pay the buyer's agent. However, let's just say that you're willing to at least consider it. Why should you be willing to consider it? Because if you don't consider it, there are going to be an awful lot of buyers that are going to be unable to look at your house at all. Whereas if you're at least able to consider it, you can choose the highest net bid. That is what gives you the highest net. So you're in no worse a position if you opt to pay, because you may end up with a buyer who, doesn't have to pay their agent, or you may end up with a buyer that does. But in any case, you just choose the highest net price to you. Otherwise, you're just precluding a lot of buyers from looking at from your home. And in fact, you are, because if a buyer has to pay their own agent, they've got to pay their own agent. They've got to come up with the down payment. They've got to come up with the closing costs. And we all know how challenged it is for many, particularly first-time home buyers, to come up with closing costs and down payment as it is. So any seller's agent worth their salt is going to say to their seller, gee, at least be willing to look at paying the buyer's agent commission and then just take the highest net to you. So what do I mean by that? Next slide. Here's an example. Let's say the seller agrees with their agent that they would pay a 2.5% fee. And yeah, I want full service. I want you to do everything. I want you to do all the showings, run the open house, evaluate all the offers. I want full service. I'm going to pay you 2.5%. I'm going to pay you a 2.5% fee. Buyer one says to their agent, I've never done this before. Yes, I want full service. And I actually think that what's going to happen is the buyer's agents and seller's agents are each going to have a package of services. You want full service, it's X. You want negotiating help only, it's Y. You want this type of advice, here's my price. So you're going to end up with so everyone's going to have a fee schedule. So let's say buyer one says, you want full service, I'm willing to pay a 3% agent fee. Buyer two has negotiated a 1% agent fee with his broker because he's done this before. He just wants help on negotiation. So now let's take a next slide, please. Let's work out an example. So buyer one, who's hit with a 3% agent fee, bids $300,000. The buyer's agent fee is 3% or $9,000. The seller's agent fee is 2.5% or $7,500. So the net to the seller is $283,500. Buyer two puts in a little bit lower offer. He bids $296,000 on the home. He has a 1% buyer's agent fee of $2,960. And of course, the 2.5% agent's fee, which in this case is $7,400. So the net to the seller is $285,640. Could you click again on the slide? You can see that that buyer two is in fact the preferred buyer, even though he's a lower bid. The seller will, let's say Matt's the seller, he's going to say, well, gee, I'd much rather have $285,640 than $283,500. Better for me. So he's picked the highest net to him. So by, even though he absorbs the buyer's agent fee, he's allowed for the widest range of buyers to participate in the bid, And it turns out he has selected someone with a little bit lower bid and a little bit lower and a lot lower agent's fee, but it's not going to always turn out that way. Basically, you would assume that every seller's agent is going to say to their seller, offer to pay the buyer's agent, and we'll just pick the highest price to you. You've got the widest range of buyers to choose from. You'll get the most bids. We'll choose the highest net to you. And with a little luck, we'll get a couple of bids and we can put them against each other. So, I think this is incredibly pro-choice in the long term in terms of the fact that it allows everyone to select the basket of services they want. However, it's going to be incredibly confusing in the long run. I think sort of the seller is basically going to continue to pay the agent's fee because that's the only thing that makes sense. Otherwise, you're going to limit your pool of buyers so much. And with FHA and the GSEs, if the buyer pays the fees, they can't finance they pays the fees as agent commissions, they can't finance those fees. So it basically makes so much sense for the seller's agent to say to the seller, well, of course, you'll continue to pay the fee. The fee, we'll just pick the highest net price to you. Implication, next slide, please. The implications of this. It's going to take a long time for the true implications of this to play out. I don't think real estate agents' fees go down tomorrow. I don't think you end up with a wider basket of services tomorrow. I don't think you end up with detailed fee schedules with agents say, I'll do this for this amount of money and this for this amount of money tomorrow. I think that's all going to take time to evolve. I think every community is going to develop its own practices. However, fees should drop over time as buyers and sellers pick the basket of services that work best for them. Right now, that sort of full service, you got to have it all structure is really very much in place, because the seller will say right now, the seller's agent says to the seller, well, listen, I can put a lower offer on the multiple listing service and my offer to split with the buyer, but then you won't get any buyer's agents, but then you won't get any buyers looking because you're just going to look so out of line relative to everyone else. So if a buyer's agent is showing their buyer 4 properties, you won't be one of them. So right now, there's almost, even though in theory all fees are negotiable, everyone is sort of forced to select that selecting that full service basket of services has become the norm, and this essentially breaks that link, which I think is positive. I think it's important to realize that there are some distributional implications of this. While fees are going to go down for all, they're likely to go down less for lower home values and for the first-time home buyers who need fuller service realtors. That is, it doesn't cost it costs the same amount of time to show a lower value home as a higher value home. And first-time home buyers who haven't done this before generally need more hand-holding. So I think fees are going to go down for all, but they're going to go down less for groups where that is not desirable, in particular those with lower home values and first-time home buyers. And I think you guys have a huge role in explaining all of this to potential buyers. But I think the most important thing that you have to explain to potential buyers is you're signing a contract with your agent, but the seller will likely pick up the costs of that agent because that is the only system that makes sense. Again, most sellers will still be picking up the costs of your agent because that is the only thing that makes sense. And I think you also have a bigger role in terms of explaining to the to potential borrowers, oh, and here's what the contracts look like, and explaining to them the services that they can opt in for, which is something completely different, because historically the buyer has had no vote in terms of the basket of services with their agent. They're not even a part of the negotiation, whereas now they're a critical part of the negotiation. And explaining to a buyer, listen, you really can opt for less than full service if that fits you, if you're comfortable with that. So again, two roles of the housing counselors are explaining the buyer's contract with their buyer's agent and how to think about the various services that are offered. And second, explaining to them that most sellers will in fact still be paying for will still be paying their buyer's agent. I've seen some advertisements in various localities that say that where the realtor is essentially pretending to the buyer that, hey, I'm special. I can work with you so you don't have to pay my fee. In fact, I think that will become the. So with that, let me wrap it up, and two more very quick slides. Next slide, please. We've done a couple of blogs on this, and here are the links to the blogs. The last one was in March, basically explaining a lot of the points that I made in this talk today. Real estate agent fees will help all buyers and sellers, but will also help some more than others. And then finally, my contact information is on the last slide. Next slide, please. This is my contact information. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I look forward to questions after Paul's discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess there's 232 housing counselors still with us from across the United States, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. I am a real estate broker. I am a realtor, been a realtor for 31 years. And what I've tried to do with this presentation is to give housing counselors an understanding of what I believe are the important points of the NAR settlement. I would also share with you that for the past 22 years, I have been a volunteer at a housing counseling agency here in Massachusetts and taught the agent portion or realtor portion of the first-time homebuyer class over that period of time. Next slide, please. There are 13 points that I think are critical for all housing counselors to be aware of effective August 17th. The first one is that a buyer agency contract does not replace a state agency disclosure form in states where such a form is required. Both forms may be required, the agency disclosure form and the actual buyer agency contract. As has already been mentioned by Matt and Lori, before an agent shows a property, and it can be virtual or in person, the agent and the consumer must, not should, must enter into a buyer agency contract. The terms of the contract, every aspect of the contract is negotiable between the licensee and the consumer. There is no such thing as a standard buyer agency contract. There is no standard commission charge by a buyer agent. There's no standard set of services that can be provided by an agent in a buyer agency contract. And there's no standard length of a buyer agency contract. I think Matt mentioned the possibility of a one-day contract. That's absolutely correct. A consumer can sign a contract with a realtor to see a specific property, and based upon that one property in that one community, they've met the obligation to have a contract, and they've been very specific about the terms of that contract. when you as housing counselors are counseling your consumers, it's critical to spend time with them so that they understand what the contract really means. And I'm going to go into that a little bit later in this presentation. Next slide, please. The compensation to a buyer agent cannot be offered in a multiple listing platform. And it's just not possible under the terms of the settlement. The total compensation that a buyer agent receives from all sources cannot be greater than the amount specified in the buyer agent contract. Let me give you an example. Buyer agent agrees to receive from a buyer 2%, and a seller agrees to offer 2%. So that's a total of 4%. But in the buyer agent contract, the total compensation is 3%. It cannot exceed that 3% number. That's just how it is. It's important for you to recognize, since this audience is from all across our country, that each state has its own licensing laws, and that in each state, each licensee, each realtor must comply with that state licensing law. In addition, each state has its own board of realtors, possibly multiple realtor local boards, and that as a result, buyer agency contracts will vary from state to state, and I suspect will vary within each state. In Massachusetts, where I practice real estate, the Massachusetts Association of Realtors has developed a whole series of forms in compliance with the guidelines, the settlement guidelines, and the guidance from the National Association of Realtors. But I will also tell you that the Greater Boston Association of Realtors, which is the largest local board in Massachusetts, has developed their own set of forms that possible in many, many states. And it's critical for you as a counselor to figure out which local board may have forms that apply to the area where your consumers come from. It's also important to recognize that multiple listing services are, in Massachusetts, there are 3. In most other states, there can be even more. So it's really important for you to understand and recognize what the different multiple listing services are, and understand that each multiple listing service has the right to adopt its own policies for its membership. Next slide, please. The last 2 points of the important 13 points is that realtor associations and MLS organizations are in the process of changing their policies and forms in compliance with the August 17th deadline. Florida adopted new forms, if I remember correctly, Friday of last week. So those forms adopted by the Florida Association of Realtors. I don't know the status in the other states, but it is really important for you as a housing counselor to be aware that there could be multiple forms, and try and obtain samples of those forms so that you can use those samples as you are counseling your clients. And if Matt said that it's effective August 10th, I thought it was effective August 11th. I'm not going to quibble over one day, but it's really important that veterans may now compensate a buyer agent using a buyer agent contract. This is new, and this is to the benefit of veterans. Next slide, please. How does a buyer agent get paid? Well, I think they can be paid in 4 different ways. The first is directly by the buyer. The second is the seller agreeing to pay the buyer agent directly. The third is that the seller agent may pay the buyer agent with the approval of the seller. And the fourth is there may be a combination of the above 3 approaches. It is critical that however it is worked out, that it's in writing and that the amount of the compensation, as I said earlier, does not exceed the contract between the buyer and the buyer's agent. Next slide, please. I want to have you, as a counselor, be sensitive to the following. Sellers may also need the assistance, your assistance, in selling their property. The NAR settlement agreement also impacts sellers. State and local realtor boards are also revising the contracts that are used by seller agents. There are many seniors who have owned their home for 20 plus years or more who are not aware of these new policies as a result of the NAR settlement. They may not be aware of federal, state, and local fair housing laws, and they may not be aware of federal and state lead paint laws. It's really important for you as a counselor to recognize that there are seniors who need your help, your guidance in understanding the sale of their home. Seniors may also need assistance with reverse mortgages on their property and their home equity loans. And how a seller agent is compensated is negotiated with the seller in the exact same way that a buyer agent negotiates compensation with a buyer. So please be sensitive to that group of individuals who may really need your guidance and assistance. Next slide, please. Partnerships between housing counseling agencies and realtors directly benefit consumers. Matt mentioned this earlier, the National Association of Realtors awards grants right now to local and state realtor associations to specifically increase services to underserved populations. And I'm going to say, implore you to please contact your local realtor association or state association and express an interest in establishing a cooperative program, like offering a first-time home buyer class to consumers who do not speak English as their primary language. Ask realtors to volunteer to teach the agent portion of your first-time home buyer class. I can tell you that in Howard County, Maryland, that housing counseling group and the Howard County Association of Realtors work very closely together to offer first-time homebuyer classes to people who primarily had Spanish as their language. The National Association of Realtors wants to do everything it can to advocate providing the best possible services to consumers. And I also wanted to make sure people understand that if a realtor refers a client to a housing counseling agency, the agency can refer that client back to the realtor when the counseling is completed. That is absolutely permitted under HUD housing counseling guidelines. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Next slide, please. Resources. Matt mentioned facts.realtor. There's enough reading material there for a week. Please go there. Take advantage of that information. It's not just for realtors. It's for the public. It's for you as a housing counselor. And the more you are familiar with it, the better services you will be providing to the individuals who you are counseling. I want to encourage you to contact your local state realtor association and ask them if they have a staff member who would be willing to meet with your agency to explain the NAR settlement face-to-face or via Zoom, and go over the samples of the local forms and respond to questions about how the settlement agreement is being implemented locally. Don't feel that that ask is inappropriate. I would say to you that it is very appropriate. I also want to share with you that HUD is working on creating an online resource right now regarding the NAR settlement on the HUD website. The resource should be announced, we hope, in the fall of 2024 or in the winter of 2024. I happen to be the co-chair of the committee that's in the process of developing the information that will be posted on the HUD website. Next slide, please. That's me. You have my email address and you have my cell phone number. And I don't give that out as a joke. I'm being very serious. This is a serious time for housing counselors. It's a serious time for consumers, and it's a serious time for realtors. And the only way we are all going to work together to do the best job for consumers is by talking with one another and answering questions. So way after this webinar is over, if somebody says, gee, I'm going to call Paul Yorkis, or I'm going to email Paul and ask him a question, I'm happy to respond to them. I really am. This is really important to me, both personally and professionally. I want to just make sure each of you understand that I am a member of the HUD Housing Counseling Federal Advisory Committee. The information I have shared today does not represent the official policies of the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the Office of Housing Counseling. I have to make that disclaimer because it's important for you to know that, because I am a member of a committee. I am not an employee of HUD, and I do not officially set policy. And that concludes my presentation. And I guess we're now going to be responding to your questions.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to all of our panelists. This was really great. So informative, so much great information. And we have a ton of questions to get through. But I do want to reiterate what Paul said about coordinating and partnering with your local real estate agents. We all, as housing counselors, have those really close, tight relationships with real estate agents. Leverage those, get their assistance, work closely with them. They're going to need you as much as you need them. So it's really good to keep partnering. And one of the things that I just want to comment, we always try to have somebody from the housing counseling world on these webinars to offer a housing counseling perspective. This is a pretty new a new issue that has come up, and we chose Paul because he really does have his feet in both worlds. So we thought Paul would be a great person to kind of represent the housing counseling field. And I want to say thank you, Paul. You did a great job.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, and Lori and Matt. And housing counseling is critical with the housing shortage in America right now and the challenges. So I respect a great deal the role of the housing counselor and housing counseling agencies.
Great. So let's get right to the questions. Is there a timeline for the VA to provide a permanent policy regarding compensation for the buying agent? Any of the panelists have an answer? Know anything? Go ahead, Matt.
Well, first of all, I also wanted to just say thank you again for everybody's attention, and kudos to my fellow panelists. Everybody did a wonderful job, and really appreciate the varying perspectives. I did just want to say one thing. Of course, I appreciate that Paul and Lori both gave examples to try to exemplify situations that you will likely encounter and that are real to you all. Of course, I just have to give the disclaimer that those are just examples. The National Association of Realtors doesn't, endorse any specific amounts. Everything is negotiable. Nothing is set or determined by NAR. Those are unilateral business decisions made by brokerages in court in negotiation with their consumers. Okay, lawyer stuff out of the way. Regarding the VA, timeline, they have not given any, and it is my understanding that they wanted to make sure that there was these local variances put in place before the settlement agreement and the practice changes took effect, to make sure that there wasn't, to try to mitigate any harm to veteran borrowers with their ability to get representation, but that they are going to be taking their time about looking as to whether or not there is even a longer term like final rulemaking is even necessary, but that is a long process. You have to go through the Federal Register. It can take as long as 90 to 120 days for the comment period, and that's even after they've worked out the rules. So this seems to be in place for the foreseeable future, and we'll have to see if they decide to implement a formal rulemaking afterward.
Great. So just to be sure, what this is basically saying is that a broker can't be the seller and buyer's agent at the same time.
No, dual agency is still permitted. And now certain state disclosures and consents and things would still be required. We're simply saying that if you are already working with the seller and the unrepresented buyer approaches you in the property, you don't have to have a written buyer agreement right then and there because of these practice changes. Now, state law may dictate something different, that if you are going to work with both as a dual agent with both the seller and the buyer, that you have to get something in writing. And we still think it would be a good idea, but the practice changes themselves don't necessarily require it unless you're going to be working with that buyer and going to tour another home. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, makes sense to me. The person who asked the question, if you have a follow-up question,
actually, I wanted to actually add one thing to what Matt said. As a housing counselor, I would highly, highly discourage any of your potential buyers from using the same agent that the seller is. So so if you see a house, go get your own agent in.
And as a realtor for 31 years, I have in my career never represented a buyer and a seller in the same transaction. I don't think it's possible to have a divided loyalty and still do the job you need to do representing each half of the transaction.
Well said. Thanks, Paul.
So this person is asking specifically about a certain state, but I think answer the question just kind of in general, because I think everybody probably has this question about their state. But does the buyer agreement need to be signed and in hand before touring a home? I think you just kind of talked about that a little bit. Yes. Can the agreement be digital on a phone? I'm assuming the agreement can be e-signed.
From my perspective as a practitioner, yes, it can be on the phone, and yes, it can be electronically signed. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, digital signatures, electronic signatures are acceptable on contracts. And this is a contract between a licensed real estate practitioner and a consumer.
So, are there resources that the housing counselor should be looking at the state level to kind of figure this out at the state level?
From my perspective, I want to encourage housing counseling agencies and housing counselors to reach out to their local boards and their state association and say, could you please share with us sample forms, even if they say sample right on them, sample forms, so that housing counselors know what forms are being used. Now, with that caveat, please understand that larger firms may develop their own form that they believe comply with the settlement agreement. I know in Massachusetts, the legal team in Massachusetts has had all of their forms reviewed, and they are in compliance with the settlement agreement. But as Matt pointed out, the settlement agreement still needs to be approved by the court in November, and it is conceivable that the judge may say, I'm agreeing with all of this, except I would like to see this changed, which could mean that the forms may change again. So this is it's not a static process, it's an active process. And having a housing counseling agency, housing counselors have good dialogue with their local real estate association, I think is key for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so Lori, I think that this
In fact,
question.
sorry, Ellie, I just wanted to weigh in.
Go
I'm not
ahead.
a Minnesota attorney, but pretty much every state has adopted the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, which treats digital signatures much as the same as wet signatures. So unless it's specific to like a notarization issue or something like that, which typically does not come in these situations, electronic signatures, digital signatures should suffice in pretty much every state that I'm aware of.
So, Lori, back to you. I think that this is a question about your little example that you did. Who is paying these fees? Buyer two?
Okay, so in all cases, I think the seller ends up paying the fees regardless of what the fees are. And you know, if a buyer has a huge, I mean, essentially the buyer is paying an amount and the seller is paying the fees out of that amount. And that's sort of the way it works now. So basically you can finance so right now under the current system, you know, the buyer basically has a bid, and that bid includes the agent's fees. And then you can finance the whole thing because it's a part of the sales price. Sales price includes the whole package. It's important to realize that if you basically did the sales price and then the buyer paid their agent separately, that is, it was not part of the sales price, it would not be financeable. Why can't the buyer finance real estate commissions? Because FHA, the GSEs, and VA don't allow commissions to be added to the mortgage balance or rate. Why? Because investors can only lend against assets that they can take back and sell in foreclosure, and commissions are not considered such assets. So if it's a part of the sales price, it can be financed. If it's not part of the sales price explicitly, it cannot be financed. So in my example, the bid includes the payments to both agents, and the seller selected the best bid, but the bid explicitly included the payments to both agents. So, but the sales price will includes the agent's fee. So therefore the seller is actually buyer. So I'm the buyer, Matt's the seller. I pay Matt, Matt pays both agents and then receives the net. And that is all financeable, and that is the most logical way to construct this transaction. Is that clear?
It's clear to me. Not sure if it's clear to the person who asked the question, but Yeah. I think one of the things that I want to point out to everybody on the webinar is that things are going to be a little chaotic until this all kind of falls out and we figure out how it's all going to work, right? There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of if, ands, or buts. I think ultimately it'll work out and it'll become standard operating procedure and everybody will get used to it. But I do think that there's going to be some fits and starts along the way. So I think everybody should be ready for that and just understand that it is the nature of change. Okay. How do these fees compare to pre-settlement?
We don't know what fees are gonna be. My example were just pulled out of the air.
Okay.
We don't know. If I were to guess, and this is Lori, this is not based on any information. I would guess that in the near term, nothing happens to full service fees, but that more buyers and sellers negotiate sort of skinnier bundles where they don't take the full service. So for years, commissions across the US have averaged around 5%. I think, that, and that's for the full service because people have no choice now. I think, again, I think you see people negotiating skinnier bundles. And I would expect that agents will over time develop. If I want full service, my fee's 2.5% for a buyer, 2.5% for a seller. If you only want me to, help advise you on sales price and negotiate the contract, it's X. And I think you're going to see sort of scale down, skinnier bundles are going to become much more prevalent.
I'd say that our position on this is that, I mean, things have always been negotiable. Obviously, there's a lot more, I think, emphasis and visibility on that, which we think is a good thing. And certainly with the emphasis being on the consumer being aware, sellers and buyers alike being aware of their options and having choice and having more information with which to make an informed decision, I think we'll have to see what happens. The market is going to dictate what those rates and amounts look like, but that you're going to have more consumer choice, more consumer options, and more understanding and potentially more leverage to negotiate. So we'll have to see where it goes from a market standpoint, but we certainly hope that making sure the consumer understands and is in the driver's seat should create more options and more opportunities for these important conversations.
Okay, this is kind of a long one. What this person heard from Matt is that in order to avoid the buyer paying out of pocket for their buyer's agent fee, as opposed to financing them by adding them to the purchase price subject to LTV guidelines, all sellers should indicate in the listing agreement that they may consider offering sales concessions if needed. With the sales concession language in the listing agreement, the seller can accept an offer from a buyer that asks for the seller to pay their buyer agent fee and merely choose the best net deal to them. And as a result, that accepted price with seller paid agent fees is what the LTV is calculated against. Is that correct?
I think that, and I think Lori walked through the analysis, very well. Essentially, and listing agreements are going to vary across the country. I think Paul addressed that very well too. Is that you should be familiar with the local forms because those are going to be consistent with what the MLS is providing. Offers of compensation are going to be off the MLS, but MLSs may, but are not required to, allow for seller concessions to be advertised. So essentially, though, our position is that the buyer and seller agree upon a sales price, and then they figure out in the purchase and sales contract how they allocate closing costs and expenses among themselves. And that includes professional service fees for their representation. And so that could mean that the seller is offering to pay the buyer, broker, some or all of the agreed upon compensation. It could mean that the seller has agreed to compensate the listing broker and the listing broker has agreed to share some of that compensation with the buyer broker. And it could mean that they just negotiated in the sales contract in the form of concessions, some or all of which the buyer applies towards buyer the cost of their representation. But ultimately, all of this is somehow factored into the overall financial aspects of the transaction. And since they are not treating seller paid compensation as an interested party contribution, that should not significantly throw off like the LTV calculations or anything like that. Those are not backed out of the valuation of the property in the same way that interested party contributions that are applied towards like other closing costs would be in the valuation. So it shouldn't have an impact on the LTV.
And I think that you all addressed this already, but I'll ask it again just to make sure that we're clear. Is there a cap on buyer or seller percentage paid to the agent?
No.
No. Okay.
No, they're all
that's what I thought.
negotiable. I will say though that, you know, and this is HUD's language, this is Fannie and Freddie's language, this is not our language, but the extent to which they will treat seller paid compensation to the buyer broker as a not an interested party contribution, not subject to those caps, they still have to be like fair and reasonable. I mean, that's, you know, and that's going to be market dependent, but that's the language that they use.
And did I hear correctly that the realtor fees for the buyer can't be financed into the loan, which we just kind of very clearly went over that no, they cannot be financed into the loan.
That is
And
correct.
yes, they must be paid by the buyer or seller. Okay, while the seller's paying the commission makes the most sense, first-time buyers should not count on that. So where is that spelled out in a legally binding document? Should commission be spelled out in the purchase agreement?
So if there is an offer of compensation from the listing broker to the buyer broker, that would probably be in a separate agreement. We're calling them like broker to broker agreements. If the seller is agreeing to pay some or all of the buyer broker compensation directly, that could go into the purchase and sale agreement. If the seller is offering concessions and they agree upon those can be in the purchase and sale agreement. But if the buyer is going to be paying for if the seller's not agreeing to pay anything and the buyer is going to be paying that would just be the written buyer agreement between the buyer and the buyer broker. That wouldn't be in the purchase and sale agreement typically.
Do real estate attorneys have a role in assisting home buyers? Is this an option for them?
I hear some people pushing that. Most states permit it. It's considered something that attorneys are allowed to do, although in most states, attorneys don't necessarily have the ability to take people on tours of property. That's something that's usually, you know, frequently reserved for licensees. So attorneys couldn't do the showings, nor would many of them probably agree to do that. I would just say that you know, shop around because while attorneys do great things, I happen to like them. I happen to be one and married to one, but we're not always necessarily the most cost effective or the most affordable option.
Okay, so doesn't this mean first-time buyers are less likely to have their offers accepted, given that they will likely be opting for fuller service, more expensive agent fees? In other words, it seems that it doesn't just impact their wallet, but also their experience of making offers. I mean, one of the things I'm going to say really quick is this is a situation where a buyer will want to look at what is the seller offering before making an offer on the property. Is the seller offering any option for helping to pay the buyer's real estate fee? And Lori, I'm sorry, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was going to say two things. So I would assume that first, the seller will normally pay, and I assume that when the buyer's agent calls or tries to set up an appointment, if the seller is not prepared to pay, the seller's agent will tell the buyer at that point, by the way, my seller is just totally unwilling. It's not even if your agent can't pay, if your buyer can't pay you, it's not worth showing this. I mean, I think that that's going to happen a very low percentage of the time because someone is going so much against their own self-interest by refusing to pay. In terms of does this disadvantage first-time home buyers who are apt to need a wider basket of services, the answer is unfortunately it does. However, there are some homes where everyone bidding on it is going to be first-time home buyers and in exactly the same situation. But the short answer to the question is yes, someone who needs more full services and therefore compensates their agent more highly will end up being at a disadvantage in this. And that's just the reality of the settlement.
We've been particularly mindful of this, which is why, we tried to preserve offers of compensation, because we do believe it's a good option for the seller and maybe in the seller's best interest, because it does, generate demand and increase, broaden the pool of buyers who can afford to write offers and still get that representation. But we're mindful that there, in certain markets that may be, a little bit more difficult to navigate. And this is where I see a real fantastic role for both our members and for the housing counselors, is to become familiar with some of those down payment assistance programs that exist in many areas across the country too, is to make sure that these buyers understand all of the options that are available to them, that they don't have to necessarily forego representation or the level of representation and services that they want. But unfortunately, a lot of these issues predate our settlement agreement. It's not to say that this is improving the situation, but I know in many markets, first-time home buyers, low-income buyers, underrepresented, underserved communities, they've been struggling because of the housing shortages and affordability issues that have been out there for a while too. But that's why I think it's even more important that they have folks in their corner who can help them navigate this and hopefully get them in the right property for them.
Ellie, I think it's important. Two things are important to mention. First is that the buyer and the buyer agent need to discuss this very question up front. Do you only want to see properties that the seller is willing to compensate your buyer agent? That they can say that, and that's their instructions to their buyer agent. That discussion is an important discussion. The other part, based upon a meeting I participated in yesterday, is a question has been raised. I raised the question about whether a consumer who receives down payment assistance can use that down payment assistance to compensate a buyer agent. And the answer to that is unclear at this point in time. And I know the folks at HUD are in the process of trying to get an answer to that question.
Okay, so the next question is one, and there's one that popped into the chat that I want to kind of add to this. So this new process will be extremely confusing for all buyers and sellers, which will increase our influence, being housing counselors, in the process. Hence, a fee per service agreement with broker firms and HCAs would be a great win-win situation. So I'd like Matt and Paul to kind of talk about what you think about that, and if that's any possibility. And then also, along with that, how much liability does a housing counselor have in this situation? Because quite frankly, we don't get paid enough. And by the way, I just want to say, if a housing counselor doesn't know about a down payment assistance program, it probably doesn't exist. All right, so go ahead and answer the question. Whoever.
I'm gonna defer to the housing counselor on this one. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Paul.
Well, could you repeat the question again, Ellie?
So first, there was a question about whether there's liability for the housing counselor, but also this whole issue of, since it's going to be so confusing, it seems like a win-win opportunity for there to be a fee-for-service agreement between broker firms and HCAs.
That's possible. I would guess. My relationship with the housing counseling agency, where I'm a volunteer, is I'm a volunteer there. They, in 22 years now, have not referred anybody to me. I don't volunteer to get referrals from them. I volunteer because I think it's important information. How that question is a really good question that I will bring back to David Berenbaum and ask him for his guidance about that. But I don't have an answer for it.
Okay.
The only thing that I would say, because I'm not as familiar with the space and that you all do, but I mean, I think that we are all in a position, associations, MLSs, our members, everybody is in a position to continue to try to demonstrate value to the consumer. And I agree that I think that there's tremendous value that you all can provide in helping making sure that the consumers understand this and are informed and making the best decision for themselves.
Let me add one thing, if I may, Ellie. The office of the HUD Office of Housing Counseling is well aware that the settlement agreement is going to increase the amount of time that a housing counselor needs to spend with a consumer. They are well aware of that now. And how that ends up in terms of compensation, I don't know, but I know they're well aware of it.
So I will say again to everybody still on the call, make sure that you coordinate with your real estate friends and connections and work together to figure all this out. Okay, in the alternative and less desirable situation, if the seller did not include sales concession language in the listing agreement, the buyer would have to pay their buyer agent fee in cash, and lenders are not permitted to add the buyer paid agent fee to the sales price loan amount, which means they won't be able to finance them in their mortgage. This would put first-time buyers at a disadvantage, correct? I think we kind of went over that.
Definitely,
yes,
definitely.
Yeah.
That's why few buyers would be stupid. That's why few sellers would be stupid enough not to do that.
But there's a problem with the premise of the question, and it in the MLS, it is not required for the listing agent or the seller to indicate that they are willing to make concessions. That's voluntary. And so it is critical, in my opinion, that the buyer agent representing the buyer ask that question up front. Because just because it's not noted in MLS does not mean that the seller is unwilling to offer some kind of compensation to a buyer agent.
I think that, I think that is absolutely spot on. The big thing here is that, I mean, we do believe it is in the seller's interest to indicate this willingness in a legal and ethical way that they can do that. But because there may be some buyers who just take a look at it and say, no, I don't want to see that property because there's nothing out there. That harms the seller. It doesn't necessarily serve the buyer's best interest, but absolutely somebody working in the buyer's interest should, and I think I would argue has an ethical obligation to ascertain whether or not there is an offer of compensation or the seller would be willing to consider concessions. Because even if it's not in the listing agreement and it has not been advertised, I still think it's incumbent upon listing agents to let their sellers know that even if they're not advertising it, they may receive offers from buyers asking for concessions or asking for payment of the buyer broker compensation so that the sellers can anticipate that and are not blindsided. And that it absolutely, if that is what the buyer wants, there's nothing in our process that could prevent a buyer from asking the seller in the form of an offer to do those things. And then it becomes something to negotiate between the parties.
And again, I think you just answered this question as well, but how will the buyer's agreement contract amount be known to the seller and the seller's agent?
I don't think it's any other business, honestly. It's between the buyer and the buyer buyer broker. The buyer broker cannot keep anything in excess of what is agreed upon. Now, depending on what state law permits, that means that if there is an offer of compensation that is in excess of what the buyer and the buyer broker have agreed to, then they have some options. They can go back and reject that offer of compensation and just write an offer that asks for the agreed upon amount. If state law permits it, the buyer broker could agree to rebate the difference to the buyer, but otherwise they can negotiate it in the contract. It's the MLS that is enforcing this. It's not the listing agent's responsibility to enforce any of this.
Let's see. So all the presenters were wonderful, clear, and informative. Thank you all so much. I'm gonna make sure we say that out loud. Let's see. Somebody's asking about a sample flyer that we can hand out. I will say, I think until things are settled and finalized, it's a little difficult to put a flyer together. But I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that, any of the panelists.
Check out facts.realtor. I mean, it's not really a flyer, but maybe you can update it. We have a one pager for what home buyers need to know and what home sellers need to know about the practice changes. There's a for consumers section on our website. And so that might be adaptable. I mean, they are intended to be a one page, so that could be like printed out. I mean, we just ask that, you know, if you're taking what we've written, that you give attribution. That's all.
There's as Matt said, there's a lot of resources at facts.realtor, and there's a whole series of one pagers that may be very helpful.
And I did post that link into the chat a couple of times. All righty, let's see. Do you need to have a buyer agreement for an open house? I apologize if this was addressed and I missed it.
The consumer can go to the open house unrepresented. The consumer can. I would certainly encourage the consumer to have a buyer agent accompany them to the open house, but there is no requirement that a consumer has to have a buyer agency contract with a licensee to attend an open house. They can go on their own.
Be clear, our position is that the person hosting that open house does not have to have an agreement with those buyers that come in either, because in that context, they are working with the seller. Now, I do understand, I'm not so naive as to not know that there are some agents hosting open houses who are there to prospect for buyers. But while they're hosting the open house, they are working with the seller. Therefore, they're not working with the buyer. No written buyer agreement is required. That being said, I agree with what Paul said. Just because something isn't required doesn't mean it's not a good idea. If you want representation, you know, go out and negotiate, get the representation that you want in the transaction.
In situations where the seller is prepared to pay the buyer's agent, who will be monitoring to ensure that the buyer's agent compensation doesn't exceed the agreed commission?
Well, the buyer, because it's going to be in their agreement with the broker, but also there would be an ability, this would be enforceable under MLS rules. So any party that became aware of this could report that the MLS participant behavior to the MLS.
And Ellie, that would also be a violation of the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics. There is a portion of the code that deals with compensation, and that would be considered a violation.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. Does the buyer have the ability to change their agent service level during the shopping process? So in other words, can they change up their contract at any point during the process?
Absolutely. This is about consumer choice, making sure they are getting what they need out of a transaction. So I'll just give an example that we raised before. Maybe it starts out as a very short-term relationship. Hey, I don't know you, you don't know me, but we need to have a written buyer agreement to formalize our relationship before I go and take you on tours. But let's have it expire after 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 showings, you know, whatever they've agreed upon. Well, of course, you could agree to extend it, or maybe you start off with like a limited services or a showing agreement or something like that. And then once you start working together, you realize, no, I want more services, or I like working with you. I want to make sure that I have full service. All of those are excellent reasons for the parties to extend, to expand, to enter into new agreements that reflect the relationship that they want and the services to be provided. And the compensation, of course, can change to reflect what the broker and the buyer especially is knowingly and is making an informed decision to enter into.
But of course, every contract change has to be mutually agreed upon. The buyer can't unilaterally say, oh, you know what, I'd like to just pay you less, hope you don't mind.
Well, and let me give you another flip side to this. As a realtor, I show the buyer 15 properties, and they don't seem to be able to make up their mind as to what they really want. I may say to them, you know what? We've seen 15 properties. I obviously, you're not ready to buy. I'm comfortable if you want to terminate this agreement. And I say that because my time is valuable as well. So either party may decide to change the agreement.
Okay, well, with that, I want to again say thank you to all of our panelists. This was a really great presentation. I suspect that there's going to be a lot of views on our YouTube channel on this particular presentation. And Ebony, if you can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to call out one more time another opportunity to think about joining us as a member. We need your support to continue to do work like this and advocacy on behalf of housing counselors and the clients that you serve. So please consider joining NHRC and supporting us. If you click the link that Christy's been putting into the chat and scroll down to the bottom of that screen, when you go to that link, you'll see what the membership due levels are based on your organization budget. Next slide. And again, a reminder of our upcoming webinars. And next slide. And thank you. This has been great. We are always excited to see how many people come to our webinars, and we'll see you again for the next webinar.